Welcome, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, The Liberated Landscape, Letting Nature Do the Work. This webinar is part of the Focus on Sustainability webinar series. This series was developed by a group of organizations known regionally for their quality ecological education to expand the reach of our individual programs. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they're all nonprofit and largely volunteer groups in the United States. The regional groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, the Midwest Ecological Landscape Alliance, and Eco-Landscape California. And now I would like to introduce our presenter. Larry Weaner has been creating landscapes focused on native plants since 1977. His firm, Larry Weaner Associates, has a national reputation for combining ecological restoration with the traditions of garden design. The firm's work has received numerous awards, been featured in many prestigious publications, and been included on many distinguished garden tours. In addition to Larry's lectures, he also began an annual conference series in 1990, New Directions in the American Landscape. And Larry recently co-authored Garden Revolution, How Our Landscapes Can Be a Source of Environmental Change. Welcome, Larry.
Thank you very much, Penny. It's a pleasure to be here presenting to you folks. And I certainly am in great appreciation for the great work that the sponsoring organizations do all over the country. And you can certainly see how native design, sustainability, ecological landscape approaches are just increasing dramatically anywhere where I'm coming in contact with folks that are dealing with landscapes. And just starting with the title, The Liberated Landscape, really kind of refers to two types of liberation, so to speak. One is getting liberated from some of the work that is required to keep a traditional garden afloat, looking good, functioning the way it's supposed to really try to reduce the inputs that are required for landscapes. So that's kind of liberating the people that are working in these landscapes. And the other is the plants, and that's really what I'm going to talk about mostly today. In traditional garden design, you select what plants you want in a particular garden, you arrange them, and in most cases, what you're hoping is they thrive, get bigger, but you then weed everything in between. And in nature, plants have spent hundreds, thousands of years developing strategies, evolving strategies to proliferate in their habitats which they naturally occur. Yet in garden design, we pretty much shut that down in most cases. There are exceptions, of course, but in most cases, you nurture what you planted and you pull out everything else. So we're going to talk about strategies for allowing and even encouraging native plants, whether they are naturally recruited or planted, to increase in numbers, as well as strategies for decreasing in numbers those plants that we don't want to proliferate, generally the invasive and weedy species that we don't want in our landscapes. So kind of that's what I'm going to talk about, but there will be kind of a parallel discussion, which is the art in this. And I just want to make it clear that because you're shooting for high levels of sustainability and using native plants does not mean that you're relieved from being a good designer. And many of the thought processes that go into a good, well-designed, interesting, effective garden are still part of the thought process, even though there's native plants involved, landscapes dominated by native plants, even though we're allowing things to move around, even though our design becomes altered over time by the moving around of those plants. We're still garden designers. We are not restoration ecologists. A restoration ecologist basically is there for the wildlife and the plants. A garden designer in the traditional form is basically there for the people that they're working for. And what we're talking about is kind of that gray area in between, where we're drawing from both the art of horticulture and garden design and combining that with some of the techniques of ecological restoration, and then throwing in some common sense strategies that utilize and alter in some cases both of those disciplines. So let's get into it here. And what I'm really talking about, instead of planning a static landscape, we're setting a process in motion. And we're going to start looking at two projects. One that's a meadow-dominated landscape, herbaceous dominated out in the sun, not exclusively, and another that is more of a woodland landscape. So we can really see how to operate in this manner, in a general sense at least, in both types of habitats. So the first property we're going to look at, and this is an aerial view of the property and property borders. This is in Allentown, Pennsylvania. It's approximately 165-acre property. There were about 35 acres of meadows planted and about 3 acres of what you would call planted gardens, although these are not in the traditional sense. It's not a seeded meadow. There's live plants involved. There's seed involved in some places, but it's much more arranged and designed than the 35-acre meadow is, although there are certainly design considerations, which you'll see going into that. So here is the main entrance to the house. You've come up the driveway, and this is obviously a before picture. And this is after. And really what I'm going to explore in this garden is not just what it looks like, not just what plants are there, but how they are moving around and the thought process that went into selecting plants to maximize the proliferation of the species that we're planting, as well as keep an eye out for things that come in on their own that we consider desirable. Our plant list isn't the end of the story in these landscapes, by and large. So you're seeing Penstemon digitalis along this wall. And here, as you get closer to the house, look off to your left, you're seeing a planted tree grove, shagbark hickory, dogwoods, white cedar, eastern white cedar, actually a semi-dwarf version called Andaliensis is that evergreen kind of in the mid-story, and then an herbaceous ground layer. And if we look up closer to that composition, there's a couple things I wanted to point out. One is the arrangement. You'll notice that dogwood, the white dogwood, Cornus florida, in the front of the hickory that's behind it and a little to the left, looks like they're planted about, I don't know, 5 feet apart. In terms of horticultural specifications, you don't plant trees 5 feet apart from each other. So why am I doing this and why does this work? Well, these plants are operating at different stratas, different levels, different layers in the landscape. And while they may be only 5 feet apart, the vast majority of branching and foliage on the hickory tree is at a completely different layer than the dogwood tree is. So they are not necessarily, as those hickories get larger, going to be competing as much as trees that were operating on the same level. And that's one of the key, from an arrangement standpoint, is one of the key aspects that differs from horticulture. And I'm not even getting to the proliferation of the plants yet. This is really about the spacing and arrangement of plants and really looking at how they occur in nature and reproducing that by and large. So the idea of understanding layers, and this is true in the herbaceous layer too, in the ground layer, not only in the woodland tree, canopy, understory tree, and shrub layer, which is a little more obvious. And we'll explore that a little bit as we move along. The other thing I want to mention, you'll see in the herbaceous layer, there's some Euchera villosa. There's also some columbine in there, which I don't think you can see in this picture. And the point I want to make here is that to a large extent, the Euchera that isn't in that picture at this particular moment, excuse me, that Euchera is, it's the broader leaf kind of lime green that you see in the foreground, and the columbine that you don't see, were not really planted to be permanent individuals. The individuals that were planted of those species were not planted to be long-term players in the landscape necessarily. They were planted as a seed source to proliferate in the landscape. So both of those plants, particularly the columbine, are not very competitive. Those plants come in very quickly from seed, flower quickly from seed, flower quickly, disperse their seeds, and then get generally competed out of the landscape by more aggressive long-lived species. So why spend the money to plant them? Well, the reason is you put the plants out there, and in some cases you don't need a lot of quantities of these individuals because they're there for the seed. To find the places that those particular plants thrive in where there are gaps. when you're talking about low maintenance in a landscape, whether it's a native design or a traditional garden, the biggest thing you've got to reduce is weeding. You know, there's other things that go into landscape, but weeding is by far the most time-consuming element. And the way to keep weeds at a minimum is to cover the ground as quickly and as completely as possible, because seeds do not germinate in competition with any significant numbers. So the idea of a dense ground layer is crucial. However, there's always going to be gaps here and there. And there are going to be sometimes, because a disturbance occurred, the dog ran into the landscape and scratched up the soil, and all of a sudden seeds germinate, and they may very well be weeds if what is there is largely what was in the seed bank prior to working on the landscape, or there's a ledgy area where just things didn't grow well, or it's right on the edge of the driveway where it's hot and dry. And actually the species that I'm planting for seed, as opposed to long-term presence in the landscape of the individuals I planted, tend to be things that grow in very dry, inhospitable situations. So they're finding the places that the other plants don't grow through seed dispersal and filling those gaps. And then the more time that goes on, the more of those native species you've planted have distributed seed. And you've been weeding this garden and keeping the weeds out of it, so they are not distributing seeds. So over time, the seed bank converts from a weed-dominated soil strata to a native plant-dominated soil strata, which means when there are openings for a weed to get in for whatever reason, as time goes on, there's a higher chance that it will be a native species that you're considering desirable, filling those gaps instead of a weed. And this is another thing that's very different, this idea of how these landscapes progress over time, and really starting to have a better understanding of the unseen things that affect the landscape going forward, one of which is the seed bank, which horticulturists I don't often think about going forward, and how it's going to change over time. So let's look at what happens to that euchera and the columbine over time. We're all the way, I think you can see off to the left, you can see a little bit of the roof and the wall. We're going to go up against that wall, which is basically the back of this garden. And you're looking at a pathway. And you can see in the pathway, we've got both red and green euchera. None of that was planted there. And in fact, that pathway up against the house was by and large, had no herbaceous ground layer and was just pea gravel. Just a path to be able to maintain the house, walk through. You can see a viburnum on the left that was planted. But that whole herbaceous cover really came in from seed, originating from the plants that were out in the landscape with the other more long-lived aggressive species. And the euchera has basically been competed out there and has taken over an area where pea gravel is basically pure pea gravel there. It's growing barely in any soil. So the idea here is these are species that can tolerate that condition. Now this was not planned. This was intended by me to be just a stepping stone path through gravel. But this occurred, and it was a surprise to me. It was a very cool surprise. But the point is, I learned something from it. And the idea, and we'll kind of go to the next slide, here's the back of the other end of that path, and there's all the columbine, and you can see a little bit of the euchera too. None of that was planted, but I planted both of those species elsewhere. Now, again, at this period in time, and this is quite an old project. This project dates back about 20 years ago. And at that time, I wasn't really thinking along those lines. However, the occurrence that occurred here is one of the things that taught me to think along those lines. And the point I'd like to make here is the educational process, and particularly the part of that educational process that is derived from observation. And I think often, whether you go out in the woods to look at plants, or whether you're looking at plants in a landscape, we often look at what is there. They're healthy, they're not healthy. But there's another question. What preceded this composition, and where is it headed? When you start asking those questions, as you're looking at the composition that is there currently, you start to be able to, once you answer those questions out of logic or through research or through discussion of others that have knowledge about these things, you start to be able to create strategies to direct the changes in the landscape. You can't direct change if you don't understand the cause of the change. And so that's really a big thing here, is as you're working in the landscape and things are changing and you're allowing them to change and starting to do things to even encourage that change, as things are occurring, you got to ask why it happened, figure it out, and then once you've figured out kind of the logic behind the plant dynamics that are going on there, the next question is, how can I use that to my advantage? Here's another part of the landscape, a whole nother niche where, again, that whole area against the wall, on that whole U-shaped area, was gravel and was intended to be nothing but gravel, and it is completely colonized by Euchera villosa, as well as a sweet gum tree that naturally recruited right in the middle there. Now, you could say, oh my God, sweet gum trees are not good trees to have in a home landscape anywhere near the house, because the fruits drop and they're very dirty and problematic, and that is true. However, in this landscape, if you have mowed lawn under the tree, then you see what people call the gum balls. The fruits are all over the place and you're stepping on them and they're problematic. Here, if those fruits fall, they're going to fall into vegetation that's taller and just be buried under there. Although, on the other hand, there could be issues as the tree gets big and it's dropping things into the roof gutters and whatnot, that could be a maintenance issue. So the question here is, should that tree remain or should it go? And there's no concrete answer to that. The decision could be, boy, I would love a sweet gum tree there. It's a good sturdy tree, and I don't care. I'll live with the fruits in the gutters. Or no, that's not acceptable. So the point here is that's a design decision that is being made post-design. In other words, we're now managing this landscape. We designed it quite a while, many years ago. However, things are naturally recruiting, and we have to make decisions as to whether we will leave them or not. And it's not just about, it's a native plant, I leave it, it's an invasive plant, I kill it. It's not that simple. Sometimes native plants come in and it's not the right place for it, so you don't leave it. So now I want to talk about one of the criteria regarding plant selection that can encourage the proliferation of the species that you're planting in the landscape. And one of them is to select plants throughout the landscape that have basically as many different reproductive strategies as possible. And you're looking at, I'm going to point out two species here that in a very general sense, and there's kind of subcategories, so to speak, are doing that and have been selected for that reason. The Senecio aureus, or golden groundsel, the yellow flower that you see on the edge in the foreground, is a plant that reproduces largely asexually. It does produce seed, but it's very aggressive rhizomatous roots that spread underground. And what you're actually seeing here is it was planted as an edge, but the intent is it's going to run through the turtlehead and native azaleas and all the other things that are in the interior. Why do I care about that? Because it's a lower plant than the other plants that are going to get taller, because this is spring when Senecio is blooming. So the idea is that Senecio is going to run through the stems of all the other species, have a ground layer. When I talked about layers in the herbaceous landscape, like a woodland layer, the Senecio would be the ground layer. The taller herbaceous species would be kind of the correlation of the shrub or understory tree layer in the woods, and the taller shrubs would be the canopy. So the more layers there are in a landscape, particularly on the ground layer, the less light there is, the less available soil space there is, and the less weeds there are. Now, another type of species, obviously that's asexual reproduction, and there's sexual reproduction, plants that proliferate from seed. And in that island, you can see a lot of red-leafed plants. That's Penstemon digitalis, actually a horticultural variety called Husker's Red. That plant was planted in many fewer plants than you see out there, and they are seeding themselves around. Seeded plants, it depends on how they disperse their seeds, but unlike a rhizomatous root system that's going to spread incrementally, seeded plants that are moved around by the wind or by birds or by animals are going to pop up all kinds of other places, generally where there's a gap, because if they find themselves under dense vegetation, the germination of that seed is unlikely. They're going to fill the gaps for you. So basically what those penstemon are doing as those seeds are being dispersed, they're not germinating where there's already a dense cover. They're only germinating where there's an opening. And where there's an opening is where you're going to have the predominant most of the weeds that are going to enter this landscape are going to be in those openings. So these plants are working for you. They're finding the gaps and they're filling them. And there's one type of plant in the, so in the seed category, we're picking plants that proliferate. The seeds are dispersed by wind, some that are dispersed by gravity that drop at the base, some that are dispersed by birds, and basically every single strategy that we can possibly include is present, and these plants are basically finding the niches to fill the gaps where the weeds would occur. And that's where you start getting a dynamic plant community that is changing over time. Now, when I'm selecting plants, and as I mentioned in the beginning, there's approximately 3 acres of gardens here that are planted either exclusively with live plants or some combination of live of seeds, in addition to the 35 acres of meadows that were planted exclusively from seed. So if you're going to cover 3 acres with plants, and you're intending to maintain it somewhere between a wild area and a garden, not as much as a garden, but not as much as a wild area, those plants need to be aggressive. The plants that you're putting out there need to be either very prolific seeders or very aggressive spreaders. And the golden groundsel is an aggressive spreader, and the Penstemon digitalis is a prolific seed plant. So those are good things to cover large areas. But there are more diminutive plants that you may want to include in this landscape that just won't compete in that big picture. And so the idea is not that you have to exclude them because they're not competitive enough to cover 3 acres and suppress weeds effectively on that scale. But what you do then is have small little patches of these more diminutive plants that will require more maintenance because they won't be as weed suppressive, and you place them like here, which is literally right across the front door. When you walk out the front door of that house, you're looking at that little patch in that island, and really the whole rest of that front landscape is much more aggressive plants. And you'll notice that there are some penstemon coming in to that little patch. The penstemon behind it is in the high intensity, high aggressive area, but the penstemon in that little patch of Phlox subulata with the lavender flower and shooting star with the darker flower, there's Potentilla tridentata, lots of little things in there that couldn't compete on the big scale. So actually, I would consider the penstemon a weed in that patch because it could be too aggressive and it would diminish the aesthetic effect of what I wanted to achieve right outside the front door. But it's a very small patch, and so weeding it is not a big job at all. So you start to get this idea of, yeah, things are moving around, and I'm happy to have penstemon proliferating over my 3 acres of gardens, and it's a small price to pay to have to weed it out of this little patch. Here's an area right on the edge of the garage, and you're seeing Gateway, a cultivar of Joe Pyeweed. And there are some plants that have the ability to, unlike layers, have the ability to just colonize an area with one species and be weed suppressive and dense. And that's what you get from Gateway Joe Pyeweed, which is actually a shorter, denser cultivar with a more vivid pink flower than the species. But if you walk to the other side of the driveway, you'll see a rain garden, which is collecting water from the driveway and from the downspouts on the front of the house. And you see Joe Pyeweed in a much wilder setting. So again, these are some of the decisions you're making. That's pretty garden-esque. It's a native plant, it's a cultivar. Very few people, would look at that and say, oh, it's a big wild mess and hideous. But some people might look at that and say, yeah, there's some color, a little wild for my taste. So as a designer of native plants that's considering wildlife and maintenance reduction and water infiltration, all the things I'm considering, I have a choice of doing something like that or doing something like that. And part of it is going to be based on client preferences or how close I am to the more formal areas of the house. Where I was right up against the house, I had one species very clean, kind of Oma van Sweden-like, so to speak. And then as I'm getting farther away from the house and in closer proximity to the wild meadows and other landscapes that are out there, I am starting to get progressively wilder, more intricacy and intermingling of species. Now, if you could get into that garden, you would see a raised inlet so that water is actually filling up that garden until it gets to a certain point, and before it overflows, it's going to go into a pipe that goes all the way around to the other side of the house and dumps out into the 35-acre meadow. And what you're seeing is the pipe at the bottom of that image, and a very typical stone catch basin, except the difference here is beyond that catch basin is 35 acres of dense stems, dense root systems. And at the very end of that, at the tree line, all the way in the distance, there's a very significant creek, Saucon Valley Creek. It's a trout stream, very high quality stream. And I would guarantee you that if you change with the same configuration and the same rain garden on the other side of the house, dumping into the same catch basin, but with lawn instead of meadow, there would be a lot more water runoff, siltation, and erosion in that stream below, at least what's coming from this property. So now we're start moving into, again, proliferation. So everything you're seeing there was planted from seed, with the exception of the common milkweed. And this is no big deal. Common milkweed is a big deal. It's a great plant, and it has a lot of ecological function for monarch butterflies and other reasons, but it's not some rare plant that is something to brag about that it's there. But these kind of general run-of-the-mill, so to speak, players are very important, can be very important plants. So in a field like this, before we started, not only do we want things to naturally recruit, such as milkweed species, but we're careful when we killed off what was a weedy field. By and large, we made sure that the patches of common milkweed that were already there were excluded from whatever activities, be they mechanical or chemical, that's used and we use both to get rid of the weedy growth that was in that field initially. And we're looking here at the edge of the meadow and new trees that were planted to extend an existing patch of woodland. Now, it may look like the same meadow, and this is an early stage picture. Actually, there's a couple of points that I could make here. We've now gone back many, many years to what's likely possibly year 2 of that planting. No, I'm wrong. I was looking at it as being Blackeyed Susan. It's not. It's Heliopsis. Where I was going with that is it was Blackeyed Susan, Rudbeckia. It's a biennial. It would have been second year of the landscape. It's oxeye sunflower, which is a longer-lived species. But the point I wanted to make, if you went there in year 2, you would have seen Rudbeckia, Blackeyed Susan, all over this open meadow and running through the trees. Because you can say, well, that's a woodland. It's going to be a woodland, but it's not when it was first planted. It's sunny. So the first composition, the early stage meadow, runs through the open sunny areas and through the trees. But the later stage species that were planted at the same time but are slower growing and more long-lived than the Blackeyed Susan, and there are other plants in that category, I'm just using it as an example, would surpass those plants and take over. Just like the Euchera and the Carl Bells were in the early stages of that garden bed and then showed up somewhere else, the same thing can happen here with these Blackeyed Susans. However, other plants like oxeye sunflower, baptisia, that are long-term players that might take 3, 5, 7, 8 years before they express themselves in large numbers in the landscape, by the time that occurs, there will be shade. So the idea is, in the first, we've seeded meadow in the open sunny area and the trees. And the species mix is the same for the short-term players, because in the short term, they're both going to be sunny. The species are different in the long-term players, because long-term, what that meadow is going to evolve to in the tree grove is going to be shade, and it's going to be sun out in the open meadow indefinitely, because it's going to be mowed once a year and not allowed to succeed into woodlands. So again, we're talking about a changeover in species from the early stage planting to the late stage planting. And we're looking at what the characteristics of that late stage planting is going to be, in this case, sun versus shade. and putting different late-stage species in to accommodate where it's headed. Again, where's this landscape going? I'm setting a process in motion, and I'm setting a process and thinking as long-term as I can to put that process in a position, or the plants in a process that they're going to be able to survive in the long term. So now we're in a different habitat in the landscape. We're down near the creek into the floodplain, and you're seeing Joe Pyeweed from seed this time, straight species, not gateway, and you're seeing New York ironweed, and just beyond that is Saucon Valley Creek, where we've protected it basically. And I think the 35-acre meadow in the back is doing more good than even the rain garden is. Not that I have anything against the rain garden. And now we're looking back at the house from the rear of the house, and you can see how different the floodplain seed mix was. It's very stark at this particular time of year in this particular photograph, where you can see New York ironweed, one of the floodplain species closer to the creek, and upland species planted off in the distance. So now let's look at the landscape, more what I'd call the house environs landscape at the rear. And this is obviously a before picture. And on the right is going to be a pool, and on the left is going to be a little turf area at the lower level. And all around both of those and separating them will be what I'm going to call transition gardens between the pretty refined gardens that will be up on the terrace and the 36-acre, 35-acre wild meadow that was seeded behind. So here's an after picture. This is the pool terrace. The pool is kind of out of the picture on your right. And on the left, behind that vegetation is a little kind of secluded lawn patch. And we go up to the top. Now this is where we are planting this much more closely to a traditional garden. These are, it's a pretty big terrace. The bed areas where these plants are going in are small. So we need more design control. We're not going to let things get as wild looking in this close of proximity as we might in the transition gardens, which there are things that we might hold back in the transition gardens that we would let go in the meadows where it's really much wilder. However, we're still looking very closely at the soil composite, the soil type that we have here, which is more alkaline, the hydrology up here, and trying to look at, trying to draw our plant palette, not necessarily exclusively, but by and large from species that would occur in this kind of condition. Now, flagstone patio is not a natural condition. So what are we talking about here? What we're talking about in this case is approximating, looking at the pH, looking at the hydrology, looking at the sun, looking at the slope aspect, if any, and really trying to determine what is the habitat type that it most resembles this kind of situation when you have a very altered situation. So here's the plan for that. You're looking at the, on the left, the beige is the house, the gray to the right of that is the flagstone terrace with the plantings inside of it. There's a staircase going directly down to the pool, and you can see the lawn area and the plantings around it, and then off you can see a path heading off into the meadow, and the meadow goes far beyond this image. So let's kind of look at how that plays out. All right, I want to kind of come back to proliferation and how plants are interacting and changing in the landscape. Columbine was not planted there, but green and gold was, Chrysogonum virginianum. And that's an interesting plant because Chrysogonum in nature is a plant that by and large proliferates vegetatively also, or asexually, like the golden groundsel that I mentioned earlier. But in this case, it's a stoloniferous plant, not a rhizomatous plant, meaning instead of expanding by underground roots, it's expanding by stems that creep across the above ground, horizontally ground hugging above ground. These stoloniferous plants do something interesting though. What they do is, if you look at most of them in nature, you'll see they have wide internodal spaces and a wiry stem and then a little clump of foliage and then a wiry stem and a clump of foliage. This doesn't have that so much because it's a cultivar that was intended to be more dense, Allen bush. But in nature, stoloniferous plants, what are they actually doing? In a plant composition where there are other species in and around it, What that plant is doing is it's sending out that stem, and as long as it's with underneath dense vegetation, it's keeping going until it finds a little opening or gap, and then it puts down roots, and then it puts up a clump of foliage, and then it sends off another stem that finds a gap, puts down roots, sends up a clump of foliage. What is that plant doing for you? It's literally finding the gaps in the landscape where the majority of weeds are going to occur and fill them for you. So that's another type of plant that is very desirable to include in the landscape just because it's a stoloniferous plant. So we're really thinking, you think about what plants are adapted to the situation, you know, what are the colors that my client will like to see, going all the way off into the aesthetic world, so to speak. But then another thing that is not often considered is, am I including a diversity of not only plants, but a diversity of proliferation strategies? So that wherever there's gaps, there's something that can travel to it, something that is adapted to it. Wetter gaps are not the places where columbine is going to colonize. Dry gaps it is. Other plants that tolerate wet conditions will tolerate areas that are maybe too wet, gaps occurred. It's almost impossible, no matter how sensitive a designer you are, sensitive meaning to the habitats that you're putting plants in and the ability to match them correctly so that they thrive, we're not as good as nature. These plants know where they where they can grow, and consequently, that's what they do. So by putting these strategies out there, windblown seed, you're basically getting propagules or vegetative matter extending into the landscape and filling the gaps for you from a maintenance standpoint. And again, this comes to arrangement. So here you've got Penstemon digitalis again, beard tongue, and butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa. And similar to the tree composition that I showed you early on, where horticulturally the dogwood and the hickory were too close, but not really, this is the same thing. You might find 5 or 7 individual plants in a square foot there of Penstemon, butterfly weed, and chrysogonum underneath it. What horticulture book is going to say 5 to 7 perennial plants per square foot? That's going to be an overgrown mess. Why does this look balanced? It looks balanced in all probability because these are plants that grow in the same habitat and have for hundreds of years. Consequently, they've kind of sorted out the spatial niche thing and figured out, and if you notice, and you can learn general spatial characteristics of how plants gracefully interact in nature and use them in gardens, even when you're not using native plants. But if you're taking a plant community and putting it whole or close to whole in a garden, you've got plants that are almost by definition going to interact gracefully because they've been doing this and they've sorted their spatial arrangement out for hundreds of years. When you take a plant from North Africa and put it with a plant from the American Southwest and put it with a plant from Pennsylvania, they just met yesterday, evolutionarily speaking. And basically, you're much more likely to have what looks like an overgrown landscape where plants are competing and not intermingling gracefully. So it's not just the spacing, it's the growth habits of those plants. So here's the view out into the landscape from that terrace. And this isn't the view that I wanted to see, and this is going into design. You're seeing the pool, you're seeing the lawn, you're seeing the meadow off in the far distance, and in the foreground you're seeing the planting on the edge of the terrace. I don't want to see that lawn from the terrace, and I don't want to see the pool. The reason I can see it here is because I'm standing on the edge of the upper wall and basically looking over it. But if you're walking around the terrace or sitting on that chair, that's what you see. Now, the floor level of the house was fixed, and the far landscape was fixed. There was no grading there. But that interim garden could have been anywhere in between those two levels. The floor level of the house and consequently the terrace is much higher than the meadow off in the distance. So we had the ability to place the level of the pool in that lawn area at whatever elevation we wanted to. And so it was carefully placed so that it would not be visible from the terrace by the elevation that the pool and the lawn area were placed, and by the height of the plants that would be in between you and it. So again, we're talking ecology. We're kind of really operating at two extremes here, kind of in terms of types of considerations. You know, we've got wild gardens going on here. We've got plants moving around. We've got plants that were in the meadow in the year 2 that's now dropped out, and other things took over, longer-lived species that you wouldn't have even found in the 2nd year. So things are pretty wild and woolly here. However, we're still thinking just as precisely in certain aspects of this landscape as any garden designer would who is primarily interested in aesthetics. So here's where you first see the pool when you're going to take the steps down to it. And the pool is designed really as a path. You're looking at the shallow area. That's the shallow area. But that's twofold. It's kind of the path taking you out into the landscape, and it's also the lap pool, which the clients in this case wanted. But then if you go, you can take a right around the corner if you head out to that little kind of spa circular thing there, and you go around the corner, and if you're swimming in the pool, you really don't see the house. There's the pagoda dogwoods directly behind you and tall herbaceous material, and you're secluded, and you're basically just looking out at the meadow and feeling kind of in it, in water. So that pool was really designed as a path and not a contiguous space, either rectilinear or kidney-shaped or freeform. So now I wanted to get into another aspect, kind of the art part of it, or the part of it that makes a landscape legible to the individual that you're creating it for. And as you all know, all of your clients have different tastes. And what looks beautiful to one is a wild, overgrown, unsightly mess to another. And part of my job is to determine kind of what level of wildness these folks are going to be happy with. Now, most people don't call me to create formal parterre gardens, or nobody does. So to some extent, I've got clients by definition that are inclined to nature. But within inclined to nature, there's a lot of variation. Now, you'll notice in the foreground, there is heavy metal panicum, the blue panicum that's there. Now, I sometimes kind of think of, you know, colored foliage plants as not being sophisticated, so to speak, in certain instances, especially particularly in a wild landscape. Yet I used it here, and I'm using it here for a reason. When you use something, foliage color like that and architecture like that upright grass is something that is very legible in the landscape. It's adding color regardless of what's blooming all season. It has a structure that's very recognizable. And by repeating that throughout the landscape, and you'll see as we travel through this pool terrace, there's a little window that was intentionally created and is pruned to have just a view through that pagoda dogwood. That window will be preserved from pruning. A little sculpture in front of the rock. That's a little vignette that also includes the blue heavy metal panicum. But the idea here is I'm creating, I've got something that's legible that carries through the whole landscape that repeats, that folks can kind of hang their hat on. And as you travel through, I've also got these, unlike the two things that a garden designer is trying to do, something that carries through and ties together the landscape, which is the panicum, not the only thing, but the most obvious one. And then little vignettes of things that occur maybe only in one place, but that you stop and notice, like the bearberry in the foreground of the rock with a little sculpture in front of. So you come upon these little vignettes, so to speak, as you're traveling through the landscape. And both of this tie together panicum and the little vignettes are turning a landscape that might have been considered a little too wild and threatening to some folks, and now it's become something that feels like a garden to them. Again, you come out of the pool area and you're heading down the path, and those panicums are just kind of always around, and there you are kind of looking from the terrace, again on the edge of the wall, looking down into it. A lot of people remark on this picture. Honestly, it's not my favorite image, but if you really look at it, there's not that much blooming. It's really the panicum that's carrying the show here. And if you got someone that wants an English garden look, but you're planting a largely native landscape, these kinds of things can be very valuable and just take the pressure off the darn flowers, so to speak. So now I want to get back into proliferation. So we're still looking at this transition garden between the terrace and the wild gardens in the rear. And I want to look at what in this composition I planted and what I didn't. And I did not plant the Silphium perfoliatum or cup plant, the upright large-leafed perennial with the yellow flowers on the top. And just coincidentally, it's a tall plant. If that would have popped up on the very edge of the Growlow sumac that's kind of growing over the stone on the right, I probably would have got rid of it because it wouldn't have looked good right on the edge. But it the one that came in right in the middle is just perfectly placed. It really looks like I intended it to be a specimen, although I didn't plant it. It seeded in from the meadows behind. The Rudbeckia hirta in the foreground, didn't plant it. The panicums obviously did. You'll notice to the left of the Rudbeckia is a Cercis canadensis, or redbud. Didn't plant that. Actually didn't plant redbud anywhere on the property, but it was naturally occurring in other areas. And another aspect to proliferation of plants, which relates to the Cercis canadensis, is a plant is more likely in a garden where it's where competition is kept away because it is weeded, typically like a garden would be. Plant may do okay or even well outside of its natural habitat. If it's in competition, like these plants are, because it's a multi-layered landscape, now it's got to be a little closer to its habitat to survive because it's operating a little less efficiently. It's got to compete for light, water, and nutrients. So where a weeded garden, that plant might have survived where it wasn't exactly where it normally grows. Now in competition, it may not. But then to take it another level, it may even survive in competition, but it may not be able to proliferate. So to most, and there's no hard and fast rules, but to be most assured that a plant is going to proliferate in the landscape, or to have the percentages as much in your favor as possible, the more you're putting plants into a habitat that either is the same as or is similar to the kind of habitat they are derived, the more chance is that plant is not only going to live, but thrive, not only thrive, but proliferate. Here's Rudbeckia triloba, a perennial form of Rudbeckia, in amongst my heavy metal. And if you walk around this landscape, you're going to find, you know, these pictures were probably taken anywhere from 5 years to 15 years into the landscape. This particular shot was not that long ago. And you find all kinds of stuff going on here that is not my arrangement anymore, and that's good. So now I want to look, here's the pool off to the right, that garden we just looked at on the left. I want to walk up those mortared stone steps that you see straight ahead. And here's some of the things that are growing out one day that I was there that is growing out of the mortared joints. It looks like drywall, it is not. There's recessed mortared joints in there. That's growing out from among the stone, what you would consider the worst horticultural situation that any plant could possibly grow out of. You know, mortared stone joints in a stone wall and terrace. So what do we got growing out of there? We got euchra again on the right. We've got a tall phlox paniculata on the left, which was in the gardens. We've got spiderwort, Tradescantia, which was both in the meadows and the gardens. We've got New England aster, which was in the meadows. We've got Rudbeckia triloba, which is the Rudbeckia type that you saw mixed with the heavy metal a few moments ago. Now it's seeded. It was seeded with that heavy metal from the meadows, not by me. And from maybe that plant, it moved the next step into the stone steps. Here we've got columbine, Heliopsis, Helianthoides, oxeye sunflower, and what's the one on the left? I think that might be, no, I'm not even identifying. I'm not sure what it is. I knew what it was and I forgot. Now this is interesting. Here's euchra again, red, Atripurpurea, and straight villosa. Actually probably autumn bride as it was originally planted. Now again, these were not planted. They were planted elsewhere in the landscape. And this is just coincidental, and I'm not showing this because this happened by any grand design of mine, but it just happens to be that the planted composition of green and red euchra, along with a hydrangea, was what was planted right by the front door. So it actually is seeding itself around, and in a few places in the same composition that I planted it. And again, it's decision time, because you'll also notice Virginia creeper, that 5-leaf plant, that's intermingling. Now I didn't plant that. I don't think I planted any Virginia creeper in the whole landscape, as I recall, but it's naturally occurred, and it's common that plant naturally occurs. So is that okay or is it not? There's no right answer there. You could say it's a pretty aggressive vine and it might blow this other composition away, so I'm going to get rid of it. You could say, I want to let the landscape go the way it wants, and I will let these duke it out, and if the Virginia creeper wins, so be it. Or you could say, I'm just going to kind of prune stems out of the Virginia creeper and keep this composition kind of static, where the euchre remains and where the whole composition remains. And none of those are right or wrong. These are decisions you make based on your management capabilities and what kind of aesthetic character you want to have. So again, design continues literally indefinitely after you've actually designed and planted the landscape. And I put up a little quotes kind of sign there, which you can't see I did. But so the management of these places, and in this less than an hour presentation, I can't really get into all the types of things that go into managing these landscapes, but I will say this, that, and we'll look at a couple of things momentarily, that basically every landscape that we do, by and large, from a square footage basis, whether it's gardens or lawns, should be a reduction in maintenance than what it would have taken if it was mowed lawn or if it was much more highly intense gardens of plants that were selected for aesthetics more than their ecological adaptivity to where you are. So we write landscape management specifications. I'll just do a quick important aspect of how these documents are arranged. This is the table of contents, but they really are in kind of two categories. There's what you call what you get with a computer, like the quick start guide that just tells you what you need to do to get the darn thing running. Well, that's the calendar, that the person who is going to be doing the mowing, the person that's going to be doing the cutting, whatever is going to get done, there's a calendar, there's a date, mow the, March 30th, mow the meadow to 4 inches. And all they've got to do is jump on nobody has to, the point is to keep it very simple so that the people that are maintaining it can understand it. But the rationale behind why you're doing what you're doing needs to be in there too. Even if it's not going to be what is going to be looked at on a regular basis. You can say, well, why do you need to do that? I just do what just do what it says, and if you do that, you should be all right. Not really. In the early stages of a meadow, we sometimes will mow it during the growing season, in addition to once a year, end of year mowing. And then once it's reached a point where the meadow species have become dominant, then it goes down from maybe a couple mowings during the growing season, as well as at the end of the winter, to only the end of winter. So if you don't know, sometimes there are strategies that are in the management guidelines that are intended to get you to a certain goal. And when you get to that certain goal, you may reduce or eliminate that strategy. That's all in the management guideline, but the calendar is not going to tell you that. So periodically, someone that understands the concepts, not just somebody that's going to jump on a mower, it's ideal if it's the same person, can be kind of keeping track of what the landscape, how the landscape is progressing, at what stage the process that we set in motion is, and determine when it's time to move it into mature management from kind of interim developmental management, which are in many cases two different things. And the reason I showed you this image is to show you that the maintenance of these landscapes are much more intense in the early stages and drop down. And this is something that's really important to understand, and even more important for your client to understand. And this project that we just went through, which was quite frankly the first large estate project I did, and we probably planted it about 20 years ago. I may be off a year or two here or there, but about 20 years ago, this was the first really large estate landscape I did. And we designed these 3 acres of gardens and all these meadows and all this stuff. And this client basically said, let's do it all. Didn't phase it in. And I was happy to do it. And we did. We planted it fall, and the following spring, the whole landscape was basically finished. That was a mistake, because I did not prepare this client, not the meadow so much, but for 3 acres of gardens and what maintenance it would take. Now, I've been talking about multi-layered herbaceous ground covers and other types of ground covers that are suppressing weeds, and they do a wonderful job of suppressing weeds. However, they don't do it the day you walk away from the planting, because the plants are small, the seeds haven't germinated. If they're seeds, the plants have space between them, and you've just disturbed, you've removed turf, you've done whatever you've done, you've disturbed the soil, you've opened things up, and there are going to be a flush of weeds. And in this case, when the first year or two of this landscape, this client was angry with me because he felt that this was too much maintenance, and I led him to believe it was going to be low maintenance. And my problem was it did develop to be very low maintenance, and we'll kind of talk about that next. But in the early stages, it wasn't. And I should have done a better job, particularly because he was going to do this whole hog and not in small sections, prepared him for the fact that, look, this is going to, we're going to have to get this landscape to fruition, and it's not going to be this super low landscape, maintenance landscape in the beginning. But when you get there, it will be very manageable. I'm going to skip that one because we're getting low on time. But this is something that these kind of practical things. So now we're into this landscape, and you've got Senecio aureus and coneflower, and we have dense cover on the ground. This is springtime. No, it wouldn't be. The coneflower is blooming. It would be summertime. We've got dense cover now. That Senecio along the walkway is a very aggressive, great weed suppressive plant. Now, what about those stepping stones? Now, at this point in the landscape, where this evolved was, while it was a lot of maintenance in the beginning, the maintenance now for these 3 acres of planted gardens is one person twice a week during the growing season. Now, this is almost getting to be, a public garden scale when you're talking 3 acres of planted. I don't call these beds, but you could call them beds. So one person twice a week is pretty low, and it's because the density of plants is basically doing the majority of the work, and this person has to come up and clean the little gaps up where something happened to come in. But what she was doing was weeding between those stepping stones, and she was spending more time weeding the stepping stones than the whole area. And I had to tell her a couple times, don't get over this kind of horticultural perfectionism, so to speak. Just go through it with a weed whip. The Senecio is a rhizomatous spreader, and it's going to keep spreading into those cracks. There's no point in weeding it. Just weed whip it to keep it low. Don't weed it to the ground like that. That's just going to let more weeds come in. You say, well, that's a maintenance thing. Yeah, it is a maintenance thing, but it's a very small maintenance thing. And the trade-off is the Senecio is an aggressive plant that's suppressing weeds over a much bigger area. So you're gaining a lot more than you're losing from that Senecio. So here is this garden, and I'm showing this picture. Again, it's to the point now where the plants are doing most of the weed suppression. And an interesting thing, this is a picture of Tova Martin, who is a terrific garden writer, and Rob Cardillo, who is a great garden photographer, and they came to do an article on this place a number of years ago. And one of the things that Rob Cardillo, when he came to photograph, he was walking around taking his pictures at a god-awful hour in the morning, like photographers always do. And somewhere in the conversation, I mentioned that, I really hadn't been up there for a month or two. I don't remember how long prior to that day when we had visited. And he said, oh, you didn't come up and do any primping or weeding? And I realized it didn't even occur to me to do that, to come over here. And, first of all, it's 3 acres and it's 30-something acres of meadows. And it's just not what it is to come in here and primp it. But he was amazed because he's used to going to gardens, and for weeks before he shows up, if there's going to be an article, the crews are there and they're weeding everything and pruning and deadheading and making it look perfect. And here, basically, this looked the same as if you would have walked on there any day of the year. Here's a picture of what it was in the turn of the century. It was one of the estates of the founding family of Bethlehem Steel, and obviously it was long gone. The mansion that was there was long gone. And this is an extreme form of high maintenance landscape, but I just threw it in there because it's interesting and because it just really shows how different we're talking about. That's now meadow. And the last couple of images here I'll show to finish this up. You'll notice there's some umbrellas, steel umbrellas off to the left in the background. We didn't see those in the field, but we found them kind of rusting away in the woods, so we restored them, and they became sculptural elements in our meadow. And actually, you've got one sitting by itself. There's no point in putting a vine on it because it would just look like a green hump in the meadow. We're really making them more sculptural. So there's one. There it is close up. They're really quite beautiful, actually. And then there's an arc of them that comes towards the house. There's one that's up on the terrace, and then it ends in this loop of 3 that comes around the other side of the pool. So there's actually almost basically a broken circle of these that lead you from way out into the meadow, up into the landscape, up on the terrace, and then end down here on the pool garden, except down here we put a vine on them because they're coming out of stone, not out of tall vegetation. So you've got native honeysuckle going on there. I think the last 2 images here I'm going to show are natural recruitment again. You're looking at grow low sumac in the fall that was planted obviously on these terrace walls, now cascading nicely. But in the far distance, you can see staghorn sumac coming in. Now what's growing there is meadow on that slope. That's what we planted. And we've got a decision to make. Sumac is a later stage of succession, as in a shrub, so it will beat out my meadow if I let it go. So I can get rid of it and preserve the meadow, or I can let it turn to shrub thicket. And staghorn sumac's a beautiful plant, certainly something I like. Well, the decision was made here because you'll notice if you look over at the house across from that plant, there's windows. You can kind of see them. That's the exercise room. That looks out over the meadow. A 15-foot sumac would block that whole view. So the decision is pretty easy. We removed the sumac and preserved it as meadow. However, this is the meadow plan. The house is up on the left. When we did the meadow plan, the house wasn't even finished architecturally yet, which was pretty smart because by the time they designed the house, built it, and moved in, they had meadows from seed. This is the image I wanted to show. This is on the other side of the house, out in the meadow where another staghorn sumac is coming in. It is not in the view out to the meadows. And when the grasses are turning buff and beige and orange in the wintertime, in the fall, and that sumac is a big mound, that's going to be a beautiful composition and add more diversity in the landscape, both from a species standpoint and a habitat type standpoint, meaning herbaceous meadow versus shrubland. And so what we need to do here is when the meadow gets mowed once a year is to mark that area around that sumac so that it doesn't get mowed and remains. Not only mark the area around it, but not mow maybe 4 or 5 feet up to it so that it has room to expand. And then it expands the next year, and then you don't mow, you leave maybe 5 feet around the edge of it unmown so it can continue to expand by underground rhizomes until it's as big as you want it to be. You don't want it to overtake the whole meadow, in which case you then mow right up to the plant, meaning you're cutting off the roots that are, the shoots that are coming up from the roots and stopping its expansion. Again, not only was it a design decision whether this sumac and the other sumac remained or not, but in this case it's a design decision as to how big I want that to get and how much area I want it to occupy. And my management is going to be performed in a manner that will, over time, allow it to get to cover the area I want and then stop. So I think it's a really good example of this kind of ongoing process that you set in motion. And yes, the most intense design is happening up front, but design management is all getting intermingled as you go forward. Very interesting kind of landscape to work in. So I will end it there because I've already run a couple minutes over time. And open it up for questions.
Thank you, Larry. That was amazing. I have just a few questions. The first is, in one of your early slides, you showed columbine that had seeded in. Was that a shadier and moister area?
Yes and no. It was a shadier area, but it was actually extremely dry. That columbine. Well, where I planted it originally, both areas were shady because that was within the hickory grove that we planted. But where it was planted, it was in a normal soil, a mesic soil, not too dry, not too wet. But where it seeded itself in was in the gravel. So where it really was a long-term player was in dry gravel where there wasn't much competition to compete it out. And where I planted originally was really just planting a seed source and allowing those plants to get competed out.
Okay. The next question is actually about hickory. As the hickory has grown and developed, have you had more problems keeping plant layers underneath it?
No, actually, that's been a very successful part of the landscape. Both the herbaceous layer, the understory tree layer, it's all intermingled pretty well over time. And we're talking about a fair amount of time because, as I said, this is a 20-year-old landscape and still going strong. No, I haven't had problems under the hickories.
Okay. You talked about using seed to cover the ground quickly, and specifically you were talking about the columbine. Are there other native seeds that germinate quickly and could help to cover new planting areas?
Yeah, that's a really good strategy. And kind of what it's doing in effect is replacing mulch. If you plant an arrangement of plants that are intended to grow together densely, you plant them initially, there's space between the plants, and you mulch it. What we're doing here, in many cases, not every case, not in those little beds up on the top of the terrace, but in many other cases in this landscape, is planting live plants, whether they're plugs of herbaceous or ball and burlap shrubs, whatever, and then planting short-lived, fast-growing species from seed. And some of those species might be things like Rudbeckia hirta, Blackeyed Susan, the biennial form, dotted mint, Monarda punctata, which is also a biennial Monarda, Hortium jubatum, which is a short-lived perennial grass that comes in, short grass that's really quite beautiful. Some of the rye grasses, although Canada or Virginia rye, although they're coarser and not to be used kind of in a more refined kind of a setting. But basically, you're looking at short-lived species. Plants that live a short time tend to come from seed very quickly, and those are the plants that you want. If you don't want them to have a long-term presence, because that's not what your plan is, they're temporarily basically replacing the mulch stage until the long-lived plants fill in.
All right. This question is about maintenance. What was the weeding maintenance in the seeded meadow during the early years when there was still substantial weed seed present?
That's a good question. I'm trying to remember that. I do know that I interviewed the fellow that, well, there's two things I can say. I know that wasn't the first year or two, but into it a little bit. Basically, there were two visits. In those 35 acres, there was one individual that would visit twice a year and spot apply herbicide to invasive plants. And I think he was probably there every other month in the first year or two. And by the third year was when I think I kind of actually asked him, what he was spending on there and whatnot. And he was visiting twice a year and spending a full day walking those meadows, controlling weeds. And also another thing that's kind of interesting is I also interviewed the fellow that used to mow the lawn, which was what it was, and was still, mowing what lawn remained there. And I asked him, how much money went into that lawn area? And then I figured out the cost of the once a year mowing and the spot application of herbicide. And I think this was an extreme case because he spent a lot of money on that lawn, but basically what we calculated was that this was paid off in maintenance reduction in 4 years. I think that's optimistic, and I wouldn't say that you can count on that quick a turnaround, honestly, because this was a pretty expensive lawn over a big area. But in this case, that was the way it worked. The numbers, were added up and calculated. That's what it was.
Okay. And we have time for just one last question here. Do you have other suggestions for stoloniferous plants to fill the ground cover layer? You showed one or two examples.
Yeah, and there are different levels of competitiveness or aggressiveness, but things like Canada anemone, I mentioned golden groundsel, Senecio aureus. That's a terrific one. I use that plant constantly. Pink turtlehead, Chelone lioni is another one that colonizes by underground stems. Coreopsis verticillata. There are many, many plants for all kinds of situations that do that. Eupatorium colostinum in the sun, which is hardy ageratum, can operate that kind of way. There are ferns that are running, such as lady fern and New York fern. And I apologize for not getting through all of it, but there's a lot to talk about. and I really like to be thorough. I'd rather cover something very thorough. And the second project was really going to just kind of revisit a lot of the things that I talked about in the first anyway.
Has generously offered that if you didn't get your questions answered during this presentation, you can contact him via the email or through his website, info@lwienerdesign.com. And thank you, Larry. That was a fabulous presentation with so many great ideas. And thank you all for attending this webinar. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.